Welcome to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast, where we share all things people stuff in leadership. Learn from leaders who have done the hard yards and learn from experience. Hear from expert authors about the latest insights from culture to strategy and messy people dynamics. Get tips and insights from multiple award-winning author and leadership expert herself, Zoe Routh. Now, on with the show.
Hello there, Zoe Routh here, your friendly neighborhood Australian-Canadian leadership expert. I am a team navigator. I love to work with leaders and teams on exploring the future, setting horizons so they can work better together and make an impact. And I know that's you. I know you want to make a difference. I know you want to be a change maker. My guest today is Alex Budak. He is a social entrepreneur, a faculty member at Berkeley Haas, and the author of Becoming a Change Maker. Now, he's done some amazing things. This man is a big-hearted, big action taker, big change maker. As one of the most amazing things that he's done, he co-founded StartSomeGood.com. He ran Sweden's most prominent social innovation incubator, Reach for Change, and helped Change.org raise $30 million. This guy is a mover and a shaker, and he is passionate about helping people change into a role where they can make an impact, create ripples of change. And our conversation is really powerful, inspiring, and practical. So without further ado, here is Alex. Wow, all the way from San Francisco Bay Area. Welcome to the show, Alex Budak.
Thanks so much for having me. Just delighted to be with you.
Oh, you're so patient with me. It's behind the scenes. It's just been shenanigans from my side because it's early in the morning after a long flight. And I'm delighted to get up early in the morning to be talking with you because I love your book, Becoming a Changemaker, an actionable inclusive guide to leading positive change at any level. So how did we get to this point where you're publishing a book? What is your career trajectory? How did you get started?
What a wild roller coaster to get to this point, but I've worn a few hats along the way. I got started as a social entrepreneur, so combining the sort of world of social impact with traditional entrepreneurship, and co-founded a venture called StartSomeGood.com. And then through a meandering route, found my way to UC Berkeley and to the Haas School of Business. And then I pitched the idea of a class. It's the class I wish I could have taken when I was beginning my own changemaker career. And so it's called Becoming a Changemaker, and that's the inspiration for this course. And so it found such a wonderful home at Berkeley that I decided, hey, let's get these lessons out to more and more folks. And that's what leads us to be talking here today.
Well, that's very courageous and gutsy to pitch a course that's never been taught before to Berkeley. Cool. And what was to Start Some Good all about?
So my co-founder, Tom Dawkins, and I connected around this idea that there's changemakers literally all around the world, but just too many barriers getting in the way of taking action. It's a lesson I learned myself. I spent some time working in Ahmedabad, India, and did some work volunteering with a grassroots group that was working with girls from the community, teaching them healthy habits and leadership through the lens of sport. And so I realized, look, there's people that want to start doing good all around the world, but too many barriers. So Tom and I came together around thinking, how could we change the way that we fund social enterprises? It's never easy to get started, but it's almost impossible to raise money until you can prove your impact. But how do you prove your impact until you have the money to launch a pilot? And so we came in with very early stage risk capital to help people anywhere around the world get the $100, $200, $300, sometimes $1,000 they needed that was standing in the way of taking action.
So do you see that as the first primary barrier, is to actually have the funding to launch an idea that could have a positive impact?
That's one of the themes of the book, is that there's so many things we wanted to change. There's so many things that change makers need. But we sort of quickly realized, look, we can't do all of those things ourselves. We need to be what I call a network-based leader. But we could at least take action on the financial side. So that's what got started with Start Some Good. And then, as you can probably tell, now teaching, writing, speaking, I sort of made this switch to the other things that I think change makers need as well.
The other things being communication, is that what you mean?
Well, all kinds of things. I mean, we've got a mindset that change makers need, the leadership skills to inspire others to be part of our change efforts, and then also having the courage, the confidence that comes with knowing how to turn our ideas into action.
Which is the structure of your entire book, really, what you just discussed, mindset, leadership, courage. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So we break down sort of what it means to become a change maker into changemaker mindsets. That's sort of how we see the world around us and our role in shaping it. Changemaker leadership, which is kind of looking at modern approaches to leadership, not the old-fashioned tell people what to do, but rather can you inspire others through influence and through vision. And then changemaker action, because of course it's not change thinking, it's change making. And so how do you get the courage inside of you to take those steps? And what can we learn from others that have been on the changemaker journey before us?
Beautiful. I love this topic, and I think it's so timely and important. So the changemaker's mindset, we start with that. What is it, and how do we develop it?
Well, I come to this from the world of academia, which is really data-driven. And so, you may be saying changemaker, that sounds kind of fuzzy. And sure, I see that. So I set out to do the first ever longitudinal study of changemakers to try to understand how do changemakers develop over time, and what do the best changemakers have in common, irrespective of roles or sectors or years of experience. And so through this changemaker index, I've been able to find some data and say, well, what are the things that the best changemakers do similarly, whether you're 23, 53, 73, 93? And a lot of that comes down to our mindset, the way we see the world around us. So there's some common threads, but perhaps one of the most important ones is our curiosity and our ability to unlock questioning the status quo.
So one of the things you said in there is how we see the world. And then you said curiosity and unlocking the status quo. Can I just clarify a little bit? What do you mean by how we see the world? Is there a specific worldview or lens that changemakers have?
So I love the words of the American poet Amanda Gorman. She says in the poem that she delivered at the inauguration of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, she said, "For there is always light, if we're brave enough to see it, if we're brave enough to be it." And to me, that's one of the most beautiful embodiments of what it means to have a changemaker mindset of sort of seeing the world in a different way. So for there's always light. If you look around at the world today, whether that's inside of corporations where there's so much pressure on a day-to-day basis to meet weekly and monthly and quarterly targets, or just feeling overwhelmed with the state of leadership today, or beyond thinking about things like climate or racial justice, changemakers say, look, things are bad. We recognize the challenges, the real substantive challenges. But in the words of Gorman, there's always light. Changemakers recognize there's always a possibility. There's always ways that things can be better. But it's not enough to just recognize it. She says, for there's always light if only we're brave enough to see it and brave enough to be it. So to see things that others may not see, to see that spark of hope, but then also to give ourselves the permission to step up and say, like, hey, I've identified a problem, maybe something other people have seen as well as a problem, but I'm going to give myself permission to step up and do something about it.
And that's a hard yakker, as they say here in Australia. It's hard yakka. That was my lame Australian accent. It's actually hard to decide to step up and to do something about it, because we can be swamped with all the hurdles that are in the way. And you named a couple at the beginning, like access to funding being one of them. So how do we learn to step into that? How do we learn to step into that courage to take the first step and to do something about it?
I love the work done by Hermione Ibarra. She's at the London Business School, and she wrote one of my favorite leadership books called Act Like a Leader, Think Like a Leader. We so often think that we have to come up with the perfect leadership style. We're going to sit in our office and then say, okay, these are the 7 tenets of my leadership style, and I'm going to go do them. But she says, no, you got to act first. You got to have this bias towards action where you try things out. Of course, get feedback, see how things go, but have a bias towards action, put it out into the world, and then see what resonates and what doesn't. So I think first is having that bias towards action. But then the second thing, it's a new concept I introduce in my book, is something called micro leadership. So we so often think about micro leadership through the lens of the single heroic act. But that can feel really overwhelming to people and feel exclusive, feel like, well, I'm not that personality type. I'm not that, quote, charismatic leader. I'm not the extrovert. I can't possibly be a leader. But instead, I like the concept of micro leadership, which takes this large, overwhelming concept of leadership, breaks it down into its smallest, meaningful, actionable step, which is a leadership moment. And we can start seeing the world in terms of these moments. And there's these moments that appear around us every day. And so rather than thinking, okay, well, I can never be the CEO, I can never be an executive vice president. Okay, maybe not quite yet, but you could be a micro leader. You could step up and take action in these small ways. Because the truth is that leadership is really the sum of lots of small steps. So give yourself permission to take some of those small steps.
I like that. Thinking about that as an example from yesterday, I was speaking at an event, and people always assume that leaders are like speakers are these outgoing, vivacious people. And some days that's me. And then, like every other human, I can get intimidated by people I don't know and feel nervous around crowds and meeting new people and networking. And I was like, what does a leader do? A leader doesn't just hide in the shadows. A leader goes and helps other people feel comfortable. And chances are, if I feel awkward and weird, other people do too. So the leadership thing to do is in that, as you say, in that micro moment, is to step up and say, hi, how are you?
Yeah.
It's pretty basic. And yet somebody else's world can change because you've just made them feel welcome and connected in a room full of strangers. And that feels good also. So you're not the only one thinking, oh, who are these humans? So that's a very tiny, tiny drop in a pond. In terms of if you're sitting in an organization in which you do not have positional authority, like the official mantle of leadership, what does an active micro leadership look like?
So there's so many examples we could take, and you just highlighted an amazing example there. Micro leadership is really rooted in a sense of service. And I totally agree with you that sometimes when we feel overwhelmed, we're not sure how to get started. We want to contribute, but don't know how, or think we have to have all the answers. No, just start by serving someone. Start by helping someone else out. It could be having the courage to say, hey, we haven't heard your voice so far in the meeting today. Would love to hear your voice if you're comfortable sharing, bringing someone else into the conversation. Maybe it's being willing to help someone set up when they're feeling overwhelmed with a project that they have going earlier. There's so many small little steps that it could take, but I think it's often rooted in the sense of service and saying like, hey, how could I make things a little bit better for someone else? At its core, that's what I believe leadership really is. And micro leadership helps us see those small moments of stepping up.
That's really lovely. Thank you. That's so encouraging for people. One of the things you talk about in your book is trust, and particularly trusting yourself. How do we actually learn to trust ourselves and the actions that we take? So we might say, I'm going to be a micro leader today and capitalize on those moments of being of service. How can we learn to trust ourselves and do the right thing?
Yeah, it's super important. Not something that comes easily or naturally to many of us. But again, I like this idea of starting small. So General McRaven gave the famous commencement address at the University of Texas. And so he's this amazing American general. You can imagine he gave all kinds of very powerful advice about like leading huge teams. But he gave one piece of advice. His piece of advice to graduates was, go make your bed.
Oh, I love that piece of advice. I love it.
He says that you start the day and you've accomplished a little something. Simple, but you've at least accomplished something. And then if you come back at the end of the day, you've had a miserable day, well, hey, at least you come back to your room and your bed is made. And so I think that's helpful advice if we extrapolate out a little bit for leaders as well, that when you think about trusting yourself, we tend to go kind of binary, to go like, okay, to really trust myself, I have to trust myself in every single situation, every single scenario, whether I'm up on stage or in a small group. No, give yourself a little permission, give yourself a little break here and just say, can you find small reasons to trust yourself? The more you can start trusting yourself, it's a really self-fulfilling cycle where you'll realize, okay, the trust I placed in myself here was warranted, and now I can trust myself in a little bigger context the next time. But thinking back to this idea, make your bed, get the small wins, and then let that trust build on itself.
This makes me think about, what does it actually mean to trust ourselves? Why would we mistrust ourselves?
So, I mean, there's a concept going around called imposter syndrome, which is where we tend to think that others have the skills and that we are this sort of imposter, that, we're fooling people. We don't actually deserve to be where we are. Regardless of sort of how you think about imposter syndrome and whether it's more of a systemic issue or an individual issue, we tend to just not have enough confidence in ourselves. There's a lot of dichotomies between what we see in others and what we appreciate in ourselves. I love the work of Brené Brown. So she talks about how vulnerability is courage in other people, but weakness in ourselves. I think that's so apt, that the exact same concept, when someone else displays it, when someone else is vulnerable, we go, wow, you're so courageous for doing that. But then when we're sitting there and being like, oh my gosh, I don't know what I'm doing, or to admit fallibility, vulnerability, we say, oh, I can't possibly do that. And so even the same concept, we perceive it differently in others versus ourselves.
I love those examples. And Mark Manson, who wrote the book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Beep. And
I was wondering how you're gonna censor this, yeah.
Beep. One of the things he says, he's like, don't worry about it. Everybody else is just making it up too. And I find that quote really inspiring. It just takes the whole expectation thing out of the mix. It's like, yeah, if people are just making it up, we're doing our best and nobody really knows for sure how to do anything. We're taking action on what we know in any given context. So I think for me, that's a useful paradigm to remember. And I love your Brene Brown quotes. She always socks out a good one. One of the things you talk about in your book, too, is around developing changemaker leadership skills, which is really, really important. And flexibility is an important element of that. And you talk about cognitive flexibility and dispositional flexibility. What is that all about when it comes to leadership skills?
When you look at the state of the world today, the world is rapidly changing. And so adaptability is a key leadership trait to be able to keep up with, navigate, shape, steer, lead positive change for ourselves, for our teams. And so this is work done by Stephen Zaccaro, who's a psychologist at George Mason University. So he's identified 3 different types of flexibility. There's cognitive flexibility. Think of that as sort of strategic. You can imagine 2 different strategic paths, hold them at the same time, make the best decision. There's emotional flexibility. That's varying your emotional states to meet the needs of others. So imagine that you're in the unenviable position needing to lay people off at work. It's not just having one size fits all, but maybe you have one employee who reacts really emotionally and you meet them on empathetic terms and comfort them. But then maybe you have another employee who just acts on a very rational basis. He just wants to know, like, tell me the facts, tell me what my severance will be, and so on. So emotional flexibility is being able to meet people where they are, varying your states to meet them. But then in the book, I argue that the most important type of flexibility for changemakers, especially today, is this idea of dispositional flexibility. I think so often we tend to take one or two polar views. Either things are terrible, it's never going to change, there's no way out of this, we're stuck. Or sort of the toxic positivity route of like, oh, everything's fine, don't worry about it, like we'll get out of this. And so dispositional flexibility, I think, is a key for changemakers. It allows us to simultaneously recognize, okay, things are hard, things are bad, this is a real challenge, we need changemakers to step up. And, going back to the words of Gorman, that there's something I can do about this, that the future can be better than it is today, that there's still a possibility. So being able to hold both of those, not going to either pole and sitting there, but kind of a both and, I think that's a key for changemakers.
And this is actually an advanced leadership thinking skill. And I was just thinking as you were talking about this, the ability to hold paradox is not something that comes naturally or easily. And from a leadership developmental point of view, we have to get through earlier stages of leadership maturity before we can actually do that. So if you're familiar with any of the developmental models, the earlier stages of the expert stage of leadership maturity from ego leadership maturity is all about being certain, this is the right path, it's right or wrong, black and white. And we actually have to move beyond that in order to get to the place where you can actually have multiple pathways and to hold that uncertainty and work with that uncertainty and try and find a way, even though there's 2 competing paths, and trying to find a way through. How do you go about helping people get past that binary black and white stage of thinking? What is the developmental step that people need to make in order to get that, to sit in those different types of flexibilities?
No, that's a great question. I think you made a nice tie-in to vertical development among other sort of leadership concepts right now. But so, I go back to the words of Viktor Frankl, of course, from Man's Search for Meaning. So he says, between stimulus and response, there's a space. And in that space lies our freedom and our power to choose our response. And so I really like that. So we can't control the stimuli that come against us. But as I work with executives and other leaders, I try to help them develop some of that self-awareness for okay, you can't control the stimuli that are coming at you, but can you just slow down enough to sort of think about your process and develop some of that self-awareness to say, why is this triggering for you? Or what is scary about this? Or what emotions this brings up? And just to slow down a little bit so we're getting out of our knee-jerk reactions and thinking just a little bit more, reminding ourselves that we always have more agency than we may think that we have to be able to step up and actually do something about it. But I think we need to move out of that sort of initial knee-jerk response and just sort of be okay with sitting with things for just a little bit. And that helps us understand, where are we coming at this? Are we coming at it where we're going to toxic positivity, we just want to ignore it, just pretend it's not a thing? Or that we sort of get so overwhelmed by the scale of it, we're just oh, I give up right away. And I think it's in that space that Frankl talks about. That's where some real magic can happen.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice thing to point to, is that self-awareness, that development of emotional intelligence and emotional regulation goes hand in hand with the ability to move past our default thinking, which gets very hardwired at the expert stage of leadership maturity, say, for example. And in that space of pausing and allowing possibilities and looking at our own thinking and our own emotions, we start to see new connections. And I think that's a practice that takes some experience and some encouragement.
Yeah.
Because we're so used to, in the earlier stages of our leadership growth, I have found that leaders can be very reactive, as you say. So insert the pause is a really important aspect of that. The other thing that you talk about in terms of helping people move into this changemaker space is becoming a node, not a hub. I love that expression. Can you tease that out a little bit more, please?
Oh, for sure. This comes from the great work of Janeway Skiller and David Ehrlichman and David Sawyer. And they wrote a great paper called The Most Impactful Leaders You Have Never Heard of. And I love this because one of the core things I teach in my class, write about in the book, is this concept of humility. I think humility is one of the most underappreciated leadership traits. But similarly with changemakers, we often feel the pressure when we look at the scale of problems facing our companies, our communities today, that I have to go solve this all by myself. And that's usually, if not ever, possible. So instead of thinking that you have to take it on yourself, I like this idea of thinking like a node, not a hub. That means that you and your team, your organization, aren't trying to do it all yourself. You understand the greater landscape. You take a systems lens and you see who else is working on this. How are they working it in interesting ways? What can we learn from them? Rather than being totally inward focused on your own organization, your own work, you also have eyes outwardly thinking, well, what are others doing? How can we collaborate with them? It's bringing others into the problem solving with you, not feeling like you are the one that has to have all of the answers. It's a mindset shift for us because we tend to think we've got to solve it all ourselves. But I think this teaches us to think in terms of networks and see some of the complexity that exists in the world and think about how we can play our role to move the collective forward rather than focusing on what we ourselves can benefit from.
I like that. It's where is your lens and how are we being of service and how are we interconnected? Again, this is an advanced leadership maturity framework in order that we need to operate in. And it's hard work because I think in our early leadership career, we just want black and white answers. We want simple solutions. We want a clear pathway. And when you're a change maker, there is no one definitive path forward. You're dealing with complex issues. So let's talk about being a change maker in a complex issue. And I was speaking to another author, another leader on the podcast about systemic racism and systemic inequity in organizations. As a change maker, how would we start to tackle those kinds of issues?
Yeah, so of course, a lot of it comes with recognizing our own privilege and our own power, where we are in the hierarchy, recognizing that some of us have more privilege to stand up and stand out than others may as well. So part of that depends on where we are and sort of what we're fighting for. But when you think about these big systemic issues, I really encourage my students, my executives that I work with, to make sure we first deeply understand the problem we're trying to solve. So in the book, I present something called the Changemaker Canvas, which is a tool for understanding how big, complex change efforts can be broken down into small, meaningful, and actionable steps. And so one of the things that's become very clear to me is that when we try to solve problems, we often get confused about what's the actual problem we're trying to solve. So instead, I like breaking the problem down into 3 parts. There's the core problem. That's the core problem that you yourself are working on. Maybe that's fighting systemic racism in your team, in your company, in your office, in your city, among your community, whatever that is. Then there's the problem consequences. So if you don't take action, then what would happen as a result? So often we tend to solve the consequences down the line versus actually solving the core problem. But then the third thing is understanding what are the root causes. So we don't want to just be putting a Band-Aid on a cut. We need systemic changes. We need systemic addressing of issues. And so in this case, it's taking time to understand, well, what are the underlying historical, technological, economic, social, political, cultural underpinnings that lead us to having this problem today? Now, we may not be able to solve the systems lens at the first jump, but at least recognizing some of those systemic issues help us to simultaneously take action on the core problem, this thing that's sort of right in front of us, but also use a lens to think about how we can start changing some of those underlying systems as well, which will lead to longer lasting change.
Yeah, and that's sometimes hard to map out. It's hard to sometimes see the system in which we find ourselves and to challenge our assumptions about what we're seeing. And that's the thing about assumptions. We feel they are truth. And then to actually try and look at is this a truth or is this an assumption is part of the challenge of that.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So there's this concept in design thinking, which I find fascinating. So imagine that you're blindfolded and you're standing next to an elephant. And so you're touching this elephant. Well, if you're standing next to the elephant's tail, you might go, oh yeah, that's a brush. Then if you're standing next to the elephant's leg and you're touching, you might say, oh, I'm next to a brick wall. And so depending where we are, if we only see a slice of the problem, we may not be able to actually solve the problem itself. And that's why one, both taking that systems lens is important. And then secondly, making sure that you're bringing others in. So again, being a network, not a hub, making sure that, for instance, if you're trying to solve a problem, you've got a diverse array of perspectives that are coming along with you where you're testing some of your blind spots as well. So that we make sure that we really understand the system we're trying to change and not just a slice of it.
Yeah. And that's actually quite hard to do because sometimes blind spots are called blind spots because you're blind to them. So it's really hard to ask someone and say, hey, what are my blind spots around this? It's maybe not the right question. It's like, how do you actually see this issue? What's your experience in it? So I'm imagining, say, for example, in a practical, pragmatic way, working with an organization that wants to make sure that it roots out unconscious bias in its systems when it comes to creating diversity and inclusiveness in the workplace. I'm thinking that the way to start doing that is to have a group of people from the organization share their experiences in the organization. What was it like when you first started? What was easy? What was hard? How would you go about starting to unearth some of these unconscious biases and to, as you say, share the perspective on what the elephant is in front of you?
Yeah, I mean, just a couple of ideas here. And so the first is you said, you can't just ask someone what your blind spots are. I would say actually you can. I've built what I call a personal advisory board. So I've built some people who I trust, who I'm friends with and believe in me, but come from very different perspectives, different walks of life. And they're sort of my advisory board. And I can come to them with questions and to help them root out some of my blind spots. Just to give you one small example, something they help me see is I'm a big sports fan. I love using sports analogies. So, American sports analogies, hit a home run, knock the ball out of the park, right? Those things that come very naturally to me. But that's actually not very inclusive language if someone isn't a sports fan or they're not an American, don't understand what's this weird American football game you're talking about. And so that's just a small example, but actually by asking them for that, I got some of that feedback. And as a result, I've been, I think, much more conscious going forward. I think the second thing is to think really thoughtfully about power sharing, that it's not just about sort of you as the leader making sure you get those perspectives and then you make the decision, but like actually sharing that power to bring people in the decision making with you. If you really trust people to share their lived experiences with you, to make sure that they actually have the power to help decide things also. Now, that can feel scary to let go of some of that control. But I think that's if you really want to change some of those systems, we need to think about what are some of the power hierarchy systems in our companies as well.
I love your answer about, it's the metaphors that we use sometimes that can be alienating and be a blind spot. I remember listening to a speech and the speaker was giving all these cricket analogies because cricket is a big thing in his world. And I was like completely disengaged because I didn't understand what the hell he was talking about.
Yeah, you tune out. You're trying to figure out what a wicket is and you're not paying attention to any of his concepts. Yeah.
Oh, well, even talking about the personalities in cricket and all this stuff, and it was meant to be a big emotional impact moment. I'm like, no, I got nothing.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's hard to, as a speaker, it's hard to cater for every single person in the audience. And yet when we choose our metaphors, we need to be mindful of, will it resonate with the people in the audience or not? Is it going to be useful for them? And it's funny how these things creep into our lexicon. When I first arrived in Australia, say, for example, and it was one of my first meetings at Outward Bound, which is my first employer here, they were talking about doing a handball to one another. I'm like, what the hell is that? And then they did this gesture. You can't see it on the podcast, but they did this handball gesture, which I'm like, what the hell is that gesture mean? And I didn't realize it. It was only when I saw a game of Aussie rules where they're doing that handball pass, which is typical of Aussie rules. I'm like, oh, handball. They're handing something over. Oh, for them, it was like, it's just an immediate shortcut into what they understood as a common language. And that's me coming from Canada. I can imagine if somebody else came from a very different country where there is no Australian rules. It's like, they'd be like so lost. There's no anchoring points in the common cultural language. So yeah, that's a great way. I love your personal board of directors to say, you've got a tick around this, I guess, or a default pattern around that, which I think is really interesting. the whole idea of sharing power. Now, power is such an interesting energy for leaders and leaders in organizations. How do you see the exercise of power? What are the traps that you see around power and sharing power, if there are any traps around sharing power?
I should say I'm not an expert in this field. And so I think we do see that people tend to just accumulate power to the extent that they can have it, but then aren't always sure what to do with it. But something I'm very impressed by are the leaders that have accumulated it, but then they use it to support others, to use it to say, hey, how can I share this? Or how can I bring other people into this? I think we're starting to see a bit of a transition when it comes to the leadership skills or what it takes to actually lead change. If we were to have talked 20, 30 years ago, we'd probably talk about, okay, how can you accumulate as much power as possible? That way you're in a position of authority, and then you can tell people what to do, and that's how you'll lead to change. But I think that's really changing when we look at so many of the trends shaping business today, from work from home, hybrid work, flatter hierarchies, globally dispersed workforces. It's now so much more about influence rather than authority. Ronald Heifetz, of course, at Harvard is kind of the leader in thinking about like how authority is used. And there are times where we need that in times of emergency or distress to get everyone on the same page. But I like thinking much more in terms of influence. And so how can we encourage others that they want to be part of our change efforts with us rather than they have to be because they're fearful of losing their job, but rather they're so inspired because you maybe use vision and paint a picture of the future that's so compelling they can't help but want to be part of it with you. Or maybe as a leader, you influence them by investing in relationships. You get to know them. You practice empathy. You know what they might be scared of, what they're excited about, and find ways to uniquely engage them in your change. And so I think there's a big opportunity for leaders today to, no matter where they are, even if they've accumulated that traditional power, to think a lot more about how they can use influence for good, because I think that's a much more sustainable way to go about bringing others in our change.
I love that answer, Alex. That was really awesome. So I just want to capture some of that because it's just going, ba, 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 ba. That's like bells. That was that noise was I was sharing. So influence is about sharing a vision, and influence is also about building relationships where you encourage others. I'm curious what you think about influence is also identity. It's one of the concepts I've been playing with lately, that influence is identity. How you show up matters and makes a difference and makes an impact. And just yesterday, I was talking to a group of farmers about using archetypes to help bolster our identity in terms of stepping into an energy that is of service to the people around you and of service to the context in which you find yourself. So the idea is you might channel the energy of the elder, which is about wisdom and compassion, making sensitive and sensible decisions. Or you might channel the energy of the warrior, which is we need to fight for something that we need to accomplish here. How much do you see identity play into influence? Is it important from your point of view or not?
Well, I haven't heard people talk about quite the way that you do, but I like that idea of sort of being able to put on these certain personas or these certain perspectives that help us to influence in a certain way. And I think that's really helpful. So Daniel Goleman has done really interesting work around the different types of leadership styles that we have. And something that really changed my perspective on that was that I always thought, this is the beginning of my leadership career, that there's one size that you have to be. And so, I'm much more of a relational leader. But then I stepped in, I was leading this company and thought like, okay, well now I have to be like the authoritative leader. That's who I have to be. But Goleman's paper helped me realize, no, that leadership is kind of like these different hats. And like you try on different hats at a different time, depending on what the situation calls for. So when there was like a crisis at the company, of course I would put on more of an authoritative hat. But then I didn't have to do that all the time. I could put it on, take it off as the situation called for. And I think similarly with influence, we could think of it, I like to think of it in terms of like an influence toolkit. There are these different influence techniques that we apply depending on what the situation calls for. And so the best leaders will have a fluency with these different approaches. We will all have certain approaches that come more comfortably to us than others. So maybe you're not naturally someone who leads through vision. That's okay. But you can still find ways that when the situation calls for it, you can tap into that vision a little bit. And so I like thinking in terms of not just like a static person, like this is how I always lead, this is how I always influence, this is my one identity, but rather that we can try these things on and use different leadership styles or different influence styles depending on what the situation calls for.
Thank you. That was a really helpful answer, Alex. And I think it sort of ties into the intimidating issue that people find sometimes. I need to be inspiring. And they go, ugh. The imposter syndrome kicks in. It's like, who am I to be inspiring? I haven't climbed Mount Everest. I haven't done anything. I'm just a fill in the blank. And I think this is the wrong way to think about inspiration. And you talked about a couple of different principles. One is to share a vision. One is to build relationships, encourage other people to feel good about themselves and what they're capable of, and encourage them to take action. Another aspect is what you just shared then, is like putting the hat on that needs to be put on in the situation in which you find yourself. What else do you find is important when we talk about how do we inspire others? Can we inspire others? Is there a methodology to it?
I love the way you talk about this because, we tend to put so much pressure to be like, okay, I've got to give this one perfect speech. I've got 10 minutes. I have to be super inspirational, and that's going to set the tone for the rest of the company's year. That's way too much pressure. One of the things that I find is super effective way to be inspiring, even if you're not a naturally charismatic, outgoing, like stand on the soapbox, give us stirring speech type of leader, and that's defining and leading through values. So that's something you can do without needing to be an inspirational leader. But I think many of us find great inspiration when our companies, our communities, our teams are aligned with our values. It's a great way of articulating to the world, this is what we believe in, this is what we stand for. And then when you have moments where you face a tough decision and you lean into those values, I find that really inspiring. So the Haas School of Business, my academic and professional home, we call our 4 defining leadership principles. And they're embedded into everything from my very first interview at the school. I got asked about them, and they're even literally etched into the stone in the courtyard outside of our buildings. But it's one thing to have those values written down. It's another to live them. So I remember I went into a meeting with the then dean of the Haas School, Rich Lyons, and we were facing a really tough ethical dilemma. So a program I was leading we had a potential partnership, which would have brought a lot of much needed revenue into the school. Like, we're a public university. We need those funds. But I had some really serious ethical concerns about the group that we were partnering with. And we had a hard conversation about it. But ultimately, I made the case, which said, look, our values aren't here to help us make easy decisions. They're here to help us make the really hard decisions. And this is one of those hard decisions where we need to lean into those values. And to me, one of the most inspirational moments of leadership I've seen is when Dean Lyons decided to say, yeah, this isn't in line with our values. We're going to turn this opportunity down. It means less funding, but it's the right thing to do. And to me, there's a great inspiration that comes from having values, articulating values, and then especially living those values.
Yeah, and that is inspiring. And people are always waiting for leaders to make the right decision, whether it's from, are you hanging on to a staff member who's a high performer and yet a difficult person to be around, so it's having a negative impact. And people are always relieved when the leader makes the hard call, because no one wants to let someone go who's a high performer. And it's like, what are your values? And your values should be guiding your action. And that is inspiring when we see someone take a stand that way, even though there's a cost to it. We're better off in the end, which I think is really, really important. So, Alex, this is such wonderful work that you're doing. What are you hoping to achieve with the book? What are you hoping that it kickstarts with your new book into the world?
Well, I start the book with the words, "The world has never been more ready for you." And that's exactly what I believe. I come from a place of humility, which is that I can't possibly know exactly what the world needs, exactly what our companies need, exactly what your teams need. But I am fully confident that the world needs more change makers, more people that step up, that have that mindset, the leadership skills that we talked about. And so my hope is that this book will catalyze a movement to create a world that's filled with and led by change makers. I hope that people reading the book will step into their own potential as a change maker. And I hope that they will help create these ripples where not only do they become change makers themselves, they help others, those around them, also step into that change maker potential. To me, that's really exciting. And that's what kept me going in writing the book.
That's really beautiful. And the book is so well written and so well researched and really well laid out. I think it's just a really useful, helpful tool that is inspiring in its word. And you are inspiring, Alex, and the energy that comes through in your voice as you talk about these concepts in your work. Thank you so much. This is amazing. And so where can people find out more about you and your book?
Oh, thanks. So you can go to changemakerbook.com to learn all about the book. And then I'll invite your listeners to also connect with me on LinkedIn. I love hearing from your listeners and from people that are on their changemaker journey. So please reach out there, linkedin.com/in/Alex Budak.
Good on you, Alex. Thank you so much. This has been fantastic. I could talk to you all day. I feel like I found a like-minded soul in the pursuit of creating a better world. So thank you so much.
I feel similarly. Thanks so much for having me.
There is so much I loved about this interview and conversation with Alex. I think probably the thing I liked the most was his passion, his energy, his eloquence, and all that came through so amazingly in the conversation. I loved his practical tips on what we can do as individuals on a day-to-day basis. How can we start by just helping somebody out? And that is about being a change maker. How we can press pause and have a think about our thinking, have a think about our emotions, have a think about how we can be more vulnerable or open-hearted and create a space where others can step into their own courage as well. So much to take away from the conversation today. His book is really awesome. I recommend that you grab a copy and explore it because it gives a wonderful tips to develop your mindset, develop leadership skills, and the courage to take action because, as he says, the world has never been more ready for you. Yay! Nice message. In my own personal updates, we have the book, The Olympus Project, which is my latest project and work. It has been out on my website since September, and the ebook and Amazon book edition is coming out towards the end of November. November 20th is our official launch on Amazon. So if you want to get an ebook copy or get a print-on-demand book from Amazon, that's when you can get it. And then the audiobook version will be out in the first week of December. What's the book about? It's about exploring the near future where what kind of leadership do we need when climate change has accelerated and the world as we know it is completely different? How will we survive as a species? How will we overcome ourselves? And how do relationships affect our leadership goals? That's all in the Olympus Project. In the meantime, live well, lead well.
You've been listening to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast with leadership expert Zoe Routh. For more about people stuff and to contact Zoe, go to zoerouth.com.